the mind that cannot be easily governed. Human beings have never possessed more control over the external world, and yet many of us seem increasingly unable to govern what happens within our own minds. We can cross continents in hours. We can summon food without leaving a room. We can speak to someone on the other side of the planet almost instantly. We can control the temperature of our homes, automate our work, track our sleep, measure our heart rate, filter what we see, and carry more information in our pockets than entire civilizations once possessed. And still, a stranger's comment can ruin an afternoon. A delayed message can produce hours of anxiety. A criticism can remain in the mind for weeks. An uncertain future can steal the peace of a perfectly safe present. A person we dislike can occupy our thoughts without paying rent. An event lasting 30 seconds can command our emotions for 3 days. We have become extraordinarily skilled at controlling environments while remaining surprisingly vulnerable to being controlled by them. That contradiction sits at the heart of Stoicism, and it raises an uncomfortable question. What does it mean to be strong if almost anything outside you can determine what happens inside you? Not physically strong, not financially powerful, not socially influential, mentally strong. The phrase is used constantly now, but rarely examined. Mental strength is often confused with emotional hardness. We picture the person who never cries, never appears afraid, never admits uncertainty, and remains visibly untouched by everything. That is not necessarily strength. Sometimes it is suppression. Sometimes it is performance. Sometimes it is simply fear wearing armor. A person can appear calm while being internally ruled by resentment. Someone can suppress sadness while remaining controlled by it. Someone can project confidence while organizing their entire life around avoiding rejection. Stoicism asks for something more difficult, not the elimination of emotion, but the cultivation of inner authority. To feel anger without immediately becoming anger. To experience fear without automatically obeying fear. To receive criticism without allowing another person's judgment to become your identity. To lose something valuable without losing yourself with it. To desire success without becoming psychologically dependent upon success. To care deeply without demanding that reality obey you. That is a different kind of strength. It is the strength of self-government. Nearly 2,000 years ago, Epictetus built a philosophy around a distinction so simple that it can initially sound almost trivial. Some things depend upon us, others do not. Yet hidden inside that distinction is an entire theory of psychological freedom. Your judgment belongs more closely to you. Your intention, your choices, the principles according to which you act. But reputation, other people's behavior, the past, the final outcome of many of your efforts, whether someone appreciates you, whether the world rewards you fairly, these exist partly or entirely outside your command. And human beings repeatedly make the same mistake. We invest enormous emotional energy in the second category, while neglecting the first. We want to control what people think of us. We want guarantees before taking risks. We want relationships without the possibility of rejection. Ambition without uncertainty, love without vulnerability, success without failure, life without loss. And because reality refuses to sign that contract, we suffer twice. First from what happens, and then from our insistence that it should not have happened. This is where Stoicism becomes far more psychologically sophisticated than the internet version of don't care what anyone thinks. The Stoics cared enormously. They cared about character, justice, friendship, responsibility, community, courage, the proper use of power. They were not trying to feel nothing. They were trying to determine what deserved authority over them. Marcus Aurelius understood this from a position most people will never experience. He was emperor of Rome. From the outside, he possessed extraordinary power, and yet the private writings we now know as meditations reveal a man repeatedly reminding himself that political authority did not grant authority over reality itself. People would still disappoint him. His body would still weaken. Plans would still fail. Death would still come. Power could command armies, but it could not command existence. So he repeatedly returned to the territory still available to him, his judgment, his conduct, his response, his character, There's something almost ironic about an emperor having to remind himself that he was not in control. Perhaps that is precisely why his reflection survived. Seneca approached the problem from another direction. He knew wealth, political danger, status, exile, return, influence, and eventually, the terrifying instability of serving close to imperial power. His writings repeatedly confront a human tendency that remains recognizable today. We suffer events before they happen, replay them after they finish, and sacrifice the present to possibilities that may never arrive. 2,000 years later, the technology has changed. The nervous system has not. We still anticipate. We still compare. We still catastrophize. We still rehearse arguments that haven't happened. We still surrender peaceful evenings to hypothetical mornings. And this is where ancient philosophy begins touching modern psychology. Not because neuroscience has somehow proven Stoicism. It hasn't. Stoicism is a philosophical tradition, not a scientific theory. But modern psychological research does illuminate mechanisms that make certain Stoic practices remarkably understandable. Consider cognitive appraisal. An event occurs. Then the mind interprets it. That interpretation helps shape the emotional response. Two people can encounter the same criticism and experience it differently. One hears, "I have been exposed. I'm not good enough." Another hears, "There may be useful information here." The words entering their ears may be identical. The psychological event is not. Between circumstance and reaction lies interpretation, and interpretation can be examined. That does not mean every emotion can simply be switched off through positive thinking. Human beings are not machines. But it does mean that our first interpretation does not always deserve the status of final truth. This is one reason Stoicism remains relevant. It asks us to inspect the judgment attached to the event. Someone ignored your message. That happened. They don't respect me is an interpretation. Your proposal was rejected. That happened. I'll never succeed is an interpretation. Someone criticized you. That happened. Everyone must think I'm incompetent is an interpretation. A plan failed. That happened. Everything is falling apart is an interpretation. The mind performs this transformation constantly. Event becomes meaning. Meaning becomes emotion. Emotion creates impulse. Impulse becomes action. Action produces consequences. And because this chain happens quickly, we often experience the final emotion as though it came directly from reality itself. The Stoic wants to interrupt the chain, not to deny reality, but to see it more clearly. This is where mental strength begins becoming uncomfortable, because it removes one of our favorite privileges, the privilege of automatically blaming circumstances for every internal state. If your peace depends entirely upon other people behaving correctly, then other people possess enormous power over you. If confidence depends entirely upon praise, criticism becomes dangerous. If self-worth depends entirely upon achievement, failure becomes an identity crisis. If happiness depends upon certainty, the future becomes threatening by definition. If emotional stability requires life to cooperate, then stability was never truly yours. So ask yourself, how many people currently possess the ability to change your emotional state without your permission? 1, 5, 50? What about strangers online? A manager? An ex-partner? A family member? Someone who doesn't even know you're still thinking about what they said? This is not an argument for indifference. It is an argument for examining ownership. Who governs the interior of your life? The Stoic answer is demanding because it places responsibility close to home. You may not control the insult, but you participate in what happens after it. You may not control rejection, but rejection does not automatically determine what you believe about yourself. You may not control uncertainty, but you can train your relationship with uncertainty. You may not control whether your effort succeeds, but you can decide whether the effort was intelligent, disciplined, honest, and courageous. This distinction does not make life fair. It makes agency clearer, and clarity matters. Mental strength, then, is not one dramatic quality. It is a collection of practice responses, a habit of separating what belongs to you from what doesn't, a habit of creating distance between emotion and action, a willingness to encounter manageable discomfort instead of organizing life entirely around avoiding it, a capacity to consider adversity before it arrives without becoming consumed by fear, and finally, a commitment to principles strong enough to survive changes in mood. These are the 5 habits we will explore, not as tricks, not as life hacks, and certainly not as promises that nothing will ever disturb you again. The Stoics themselves would have understood such a promise as absurd. You will be disturbed. You will become angry. You will worry about things outside your control. You will sometimes react badly. You will occasionally know the wiser response and choose the foolish one anyway. The practice begins again there. Mental strength is not demonstrated by never losing your balance. It is demonstrated by how quickly you recognize that you have handed your balance to something that did not deserve it. There's another reason these habits matter now. Modern life has become extraordinarily good at provoking reaction. Every notification asks for attention. Every headline competes for emotion. Every platform has an incentive to keep you engaged. Outrage spreads. Comparison becomes effortless. Other people's achievements arrive directly on your screen. Their opinions follow you into your bedroom. The psychological boundary between the world and the self has become increasingly porous. A person can wake up peacefully, open a phone, and within 5 minutes become angry about a stranger, anxious about the future, dissatisfied with their appearance, envious of someone's success, and worried about an event occurring thousands of miles away. Nothing in the physical room changed. Attention did. And attention is not trivial. Whatever repeatedly captures attention gains repeated access to thought. Whatever repeatedly enters thought can influence emotion. Whatever repeatedly influences emotion can begin shaping behavior. To govern attention, therefore, is not merely to improve productivity. It is to protect part of the territory from which a life is governed. The goal of Stoicism was never to build a human being who could not be touched. A person incapable of being touched by anything would also be incapable of intimacy, compassion, grief, wonder, or love. The stronger goal is different: to become deeply human without becoming easily commanded, to love without possession, to pursue without desperation, to lose without collapsing into meaninglessness, to succeed without becoming intoxicated by applause, to be criticized without instantly retaliating, to encounter difficulty without adding unnecessary suffering through panic, resentment, and endless mental resistance. That requires practice, because under pressure, philosophy disappears unless it has become habit. You do not rise magically to the wisdom of the books you've read. You tend to fall toward the responses you've practiced. So this audiobook will not ask whether you understand Stoicism. Understanding is cheap. You can understand patience and still interrupt people. Understand discipline and still procrastinate. Understand emotional regulation and still send a message you regret 10 minutes later. The more serious question is, what have you practiced enough to access when life becomes difficult? That is where philosophy becomes character. And character becomes visible precisely when circumstances stop cooperating. There are 5 practices ahead. One will ask you to surrender a form of control you never truly possessed. Another will ask you to create a few seconds of space before reaction becomes consequence. Another will deliberately introduce discomfort into a life trained to avoid it. Another will require looking toward adversity without becoming afraid of living. And the final habit will ask perhaps the hardest question of all. When your feelings and your principles disagree, which one gets to decide? But before any of those questions can be answered, we have to begin with the oldest distinction, the distinction that Epictetus placed near the foundation of Stoic freedom. Because much of what exhausts the mind is not what life has done to us, but the impossible responsibility we have assigned ourselves for controlling what life was never going to let us control. So, before trying to become calmer, before becoming tougher, before mastering anger, fear, discomfort, or uncertainty, we need to examine the boundaries of our authority. What is actually yours to control? And how much of your suffering begins the moment you try to govern everything else? That is where the first Stoic habit begins. Chapter 1. Control what is yours. Release what is not. Stoic habit 1. Separate control from concern. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that sleep cannot cure. It comes from trying to manage what was never placed under your authority. Other people's opinions. Whether someone understands you correctly. Whether your work receives recognition. Whether the person you love chooses you. Whether the economy cooperates with your plans. Whether an opportunity arrives at the right moment. Whether the future unfolds according to the version you carefully constructed in your head. A person can spend an entire day physically still while mentally attempting to control hundreds of things. And this may be one of the oldest sources of unnecessary human suffering. Not simply that events happen beyond our control, but that we repeatedly demand control over them anyway. Epictetus placed this problem near the beginning of his philosophy because almost everything else depends upon understanding it. His distinction was severe in its simplicity. Some things are up to us, while others are not. It sounds obvious. It is not. If human beings genuinely lived according to this distinction, much of our anxiety, resentment, jealousy, defensiveness, and frustration would lose its fuel. The difficulty is that we understand the distinction intellectually, then violate it emotionally. You already know that you cannot control what another person thinks about you, but perhaps you have spent hours trying, replaying the conversation, rewriting what you should have said, checking whether they responded, interpreting their silence, trying to determine what they meant by a facial expression, constructing arguments against criticisms they may not even be making. You know you cannot control the past, yet the mind returns there repeatedly, conducting imaginary trials in which evidence can no longer be changed. You know you cannot guarantee tomorrow, yet you sometimes attempt to solve next month at 2 o'clock in the morning. The problem, then, is not knowledge. The problem is practice. Stoicism becomes interesting precisely at the point where knowing something and living according to it become two different things. But there is an important nuance here. The Stoic distinction is often reduced to control what you can control. Useful advice, but philosophically incomplete, because many things we casually describe as being under our control are not completely under our control at all. Consider your career. You can prepare thoroughly for an interview. You cannot control whether you are hired. You can produce excellent work. You cannot guarantee promotion. You can negotiate thoughtfully. You cannot control the final decision. You can build professional relationships. You cannot force someone to respect you. The same problem appears in health. You can exercise, sleep adequately, eat thoughtfully, attend medical appointments, and reduce certain risks. You cannot guarantee perfect health. Relationships reveal it even more clearly. You can communicate honestly. You cannot control how honesty is received. You can love someone. You cannot command them to love you. You can apologize sincerely. You cannot force forgiveness. This is why the Stoic distinction is more demanding than the modern language of control sometimes suggests. The deepest territory available to you is not the outcome. It is your participation, your judgment, your intention, your effort, your response, your conduct. What happens after that enters a world containing other people, chance, nature, institutions, timing, biology, history, and circumstances. You participate in outcomes. You rarely own them. That difference is enormous. Much anxiety begins when participation becomes confused with ownership. The employee thinks, I worked hard, therefore I must be promoted. The entrepreneur thinks, I built a good product, therefore the market must reward me. The loving partner thinks, I treated this person well, therefore they must stay. The creator thinks, I made something valuable, therefore people must notice it. The athlete thinks, I trained harder, therefore I must win. Notice the hidden structure. Effort becomes a contract with reality. I did this, therefore life owes me that. But reality never signed the contract. And when the expected outcome fails to arrive, disappointment quickly becomes something heavier. Resentment, humiliation, self-doubt, anger, sometimes despair. The problem is not that the person cared. Caring is not the enemy. The problem is that concern quietly became entitlement to an outcome. Marcus Aurelius had reason to understand this distinction. As emperor, he possessed more external authority than almost anyone around him, yet his private reflections repeatedly returned to the limits of that authority. He could issue commands. He could not prevent betrayal. He could influence political affairs. He could not eliminate uncertainty. He could govern an empire. He could not govern mortality. His writings repeatedly turn inward, toward the quality of his own judgments and conduct. There is something important here. Power does not eliminate the boundary of control. Wealth does not eliminate it. Status does not eliminate it. Intelligence does not eliminate it. At some point, every human being reaches the same border. Reality continues without asking permission. Modern psychology gives us useful language for understanding part of what happens at this border. One relevant concept is cognitive appraisal. Events do not arrive in consciousness as pure, uninterpreted facts. We evaluate them. We assign meaning. We judge whether something is threatening, unfair, embarrassing, manageable, catastrophic, or irrelevant. That appraisal influences emotional response. This does not mean emotion is simply chosen, nor does it mean suffering can be eliminated by thinking positively. It means interpretation participates in emotional experience. Suppose your manager sends a message. Can we talk tomorrow morning? That is the available fact. Within seconds, the mind may produce. I'm in trouble. Something went wrong. I'm going to lose my job. They hated my presentation. Nothing else has happened. Yet physiologically and emotionally, you may already be responding to a future created by interpretation. The heart beats faster. Attention narrows. Sleep becomes difficult. You mentally rehearse explanations. By morning, you may have experienced an entire crisis that existed nowhere except in prediction. Then the meeting begins. Your manager wants to discuss a new project, how much suffering occurred, and more importantly, what exactly caused it. The message or the meaning attached to the message? This is where the Stoic discipline becomes sharper. Are you responding to reality or to your interpretation of reality? That question is not designed to invalidate emotion. It is designed to separate layers. Something happened. Then you formed a judgment about what happened. Those two things can become fused so quickly that they feel identical. Criticism becomes humiliation. Delay becomes rejection. Disagreement becomes disrespect. Failure becomes inadequacy. Uncertainty becomes danger. But these are not identical categories. An event can be painful without containing every meaning the mind assigns to it. Learning to separate them creates psychological room, and room creates choice. There is also a crucial distinction between control and influence. If you misunderstand Stoicism as saying, if you cannot completely control something, stop caring about it, the philosophy becomes absurd. You cannot control society. Should you therefore ignore injustice? You cannot control your child's entire future. Should you stop parenting carefully? You cannot guarantee a relationship will survive. Should you stop loving? You cannot guarantee your business succeeds. Should you refuse to build anything? Of course not. Stoicism does not require indifference toward everything uncertain. It requires clarity about your role within uncertainty. You may influence without controlling. You may care without possessing. You may commit without demanding guarantees. You may act seriously while accepting that reality retains a final vote. That is not passivity. It may be one of the most mature forms of engagement. Consider competition. Two athletes enter the same race. Both want to win. Stoicism does not require them to pretend victory is meaningless. Competition depends upon caring about performance. But the athlete who psychologically requires victory carries an additional burden. Now, the race is no longer simply about running well. It is about protecting identity. If I lose, what does that say about me? If someone passes me, what will people think? If I fail after all this training, was everything wasted? Attention leaves performance and moves toward ego. The athlete begins trying to control the scoreboard before finishing the race. The more useful orientation is narrower. Prepare intelligently. Execute well. Respond to conditions. Give full effort. Then allow the result to become information. This does not guarantee victory. It protects performance from unnecessary psychological interference. Money produces the same confusion. Financial security matters. Poverty is not a mindset. Economic conditions are real. Unexpected expenses are real. Structural disadvantages are real. Yet even within those realities, there remains a difference between what can be influenced and what cannot. You cannot personally determine interest rates. You can examine spending. You cannot control the entire labor market. You can develop useful skills. You cannot guarantee that an investment rises. You can decide whether the risk was sensible. The distinction does not make external problems disappear. It prevents the mind from wasting finite energy attempting to personally command systems larger than itself. Social media has made this discipline even harder. Human beings now possess unprecedented access to other people's reactions, views, likes, comments, shares, follower counts. Approval has been quantified. A creator can upload something meaningful, then spend the next 6 hours refreshing a number they cannot directly control. This is a perfect laboratory for Stoic practice. You control aspects of the work, research, craft, clarity, consistency, improvement. You can study the audience. You can change strategy. You can learn from feedback. But once something enters the world, thousands of variables appear. Timing, algorithms, competition, taste, luck, attention, culture. The dangerous moment occurs when a metric stops being information and becomes identity. The video performed badly becomes, I am bad. The post received little attention becomes, nobody values what I have to say. An external measurement crosses the border and begins governing the self. That is precisely the border Stoicism asks you to guard. Seneca repeatedly examined our tendency to become psychologically dependent upon fortune. Fortune, in the ancient sense, referred broadly to the unstable external conditions of life. Wealth can arrive and disappear. Status changes. Bodies age. Political favor turns. People leave. The danger is not possessing external things. The danger is allowing them to possess the structure of your identity. If success is the only evidence that you are worthy, failure can destroy you. If admiration is the only evidence that you matter, criticism becomes unbearable. If comfort is required for peace, discomfort becomes terrifying. The more conditions your peace requires, the more fragile your peace becomes. So ask yourself, what are you currently allowing to control your peace? Not theoretically. Today, a particular person's approval, an unanswered email, your bank balance, a number on a scale, a career decision, someone else's success, a mistake you cannot reverse, a future you cannot predict. Name it, because vague anxiety becomes more workable when its object becomes visible. This brings us to the practical discipline, not a slogan, a practice. When something disturbs you today, resist the urge to begin immediately with, how do I fix this? Begin instead with 3 distinctions. First, what actually happened? Strip away prediction and interpretation. Not, they humiliated me, but they criticized my proposal in the meeting. Not, my career is collapsing, but I was not selected for this position. Not, they don't care about me, but they have not replied. This is harder than it sounds. Human beings are extraordinarily quick at turning interpretation into fact. Second, ask, what part of this belongs to me? Perhaps your preparation, your next conversation, your attitude, your boundaries, your decision to try again, your willingness to learn, your response to disappointment, your ability to apologize, your choice to leave, your choice to stay. Identify the territory where agency remains. Then ask the third question. What am I trying to control that does not belong to me? Their opinion, the final decision, the past, the market, the timing, the reaction, the outcome, the weather, chance. Release does not mean you stop caring. It means you stop assigning yourself an impossible job. Practice this long enough and something subtle begins to change. Your attention returns home. Instead of asking, how do I make them respect me? You ask, am I behaving in a way I respect? Instead of, how do I guarantee success? You ask, what would excellent preparation look like? Instead of, how do I make this person stay? You ask, what does honesty, dignity, and love require from me? Instead of, how do I prevent anything bad from happening? You ask, how do I become more capable of meeting difficulty when it does? These questions are less intoxicating because they do not promise control. They offer something better: agency. There's a deeper consequence. When you stop organizing identity around outcomes, failure changes meaning. It can still hurt. You can still grieve. You can still be disappointed. But disappointment no longer needs to become self-condemnation. You can lose while having acted courageously. You can succeed while having acted badly. This is why outcome alone cannot be the final measure of character. Sometimes you do everything intelligently and lose. Sometimes you behave foolishly and get lucky. If success were the only standard, luck would become virtue. The Stoic standard asks something harder. What was the quality of your participation? What did you choose when choice was available? Perhaps this is the question to carry through the next 24 hours. When anxiety appears, locate the boundary. When anger appears, locate the boundary. When envy appears, locate the boundary. When you find yourself mentally controlling another person's mind, rewriting the past, guaranteeing the future, or demanding that an outcome obey your effort, locate the boundary. Then return to your side of it. Again and again. This is not resignation. It is disciplined concentration. You are withdrawing energy from an impossible task and returning it to the place where your actions can actually matter. And yet a problem remains. Knowing what is yours does not guarantee that you will act wisely with it. You may know perfectly well that another person's insult is outside your control and still become furious. You may understand that a rejection does not define you and still feel the impulse to retaliate. You may recognize that the past cannot be changed and still replay it. So perhaps control is only the beginning, because even after we separate what belongs to us from what doesn't, there remains another question. What happens in those first few seconds when emotion arrives before wisdom does? If your reaction appears before your philosophy, who is actually governing whom? That is where the second Stoic habit begins. Chapter 2. Create space between the event and your reaction. Stoic habit 2. Delay the first reaction. There is a small interval in human experience that determines far more than its duration would suggest. It exists after something happens, but before you decide what that event means. A criticism reaches you. A message disappoints you. Someone interrupts you. A colleague receives the opportunity you wanted. A partner says something that strikes exactly where you are vulnerable. A stranger insults you online. Your plans suddenly collapse. Something happens outside you, and almost immediately, something begins happening inside you. The event may last seconds. The reaction can last days. This interval is where one of the most difficult forms of human freedom begins. Not the freedom to prevent the event, not the freedom to prevent the first flash of emotion, but the freedom to avoid turning the first impulse into the final response. That distinction is at the center of Stoic emotional discipline, and it is often misunderstood. Stoicism does not require you to become a person who feels nothing. It asks whether everything you feel deserves immediate obedience. An emotion can be real without being an instruction. Anger is real. Fear is real. Jealousy is real. Embarrassment is real. The physical tightening in the chest after criticism is real. The sudden heat that rises when someone disrespects you is real. But the existence of an emotion does not automatically establish the wisdom of the action it recommends. Anger may say, "Answer now." Fear may say, "Leave immediately." Envy may say, "Their success diminishes yours." Humiliation may say, "Defend yourself at any cost." Anxiety may say, "Solve the entire future tonight." The feeling speaks with urgency. Urgency creates the illusion of authority, and that is where trouble begins. Epictetus developed a sophisticated way of thinking about this problem through the idea of impressions. An impression arrives. Something appears to us in a particular way: dangerous, insulting, terrible, desirable, unfair. But the appearance itself does not have to become a settled judgment. There is another step, assent. The mind can accept the impression as true or examine it. That distinction is profound, because most regrettable reactions do not occur after careful examination. They happen when the first interpretation receives immediate permission to become reality. Someone does not respond to your message. The impression appears. They're ignoring me. You assent, then They don't respect me. Another assent. Then, I'm tired of being treated like this. Another. Within minutes, an unanswered message has become evidence about the entire relationship. Nothing external has changed, but internally, a complete narrative has been constructed. The first impression has recruited memory, identity, fear, and expectation. Soon you are no longer responding to silence. You are responding to a story about silence. This is why the question from the previous chapter returns in a more urgent form. Are you responding to reality or to your interpretation of reality? The difficulty is that interpretation rarely introduces itself politely. It does not say, "Hello, I am one possible explanation." It arrives disguised as fact. They embarrass me. She did that deliberately. Everyone noticed. This is a disaster. He thinks I'm incompetent. I've ruined everything. The speed of interpretation creates certainty, but speed and truth are not the same thing. Sometimes the first explanation is correct. Sometimes it is not. Mental strength requires enough space to discover the difference. Marcus Aurelius repeatedly returned to the role of judgment in disturbance. In his private reflections, he reminded himself that external events and the judgments formed about them were not identical. This was not an exercise in pretending unpleasant things were pleasant. Marcus lived through war, political pressure, betrayal, illness, and loss. His philosophy was not produced in an environment where nothing serious happened. The discipline was subtler. Do not add unnecessary judgment to necessary difficulty. Pain may already be present. Do not automatically add humiliation. A setback may already exist. Do not immediately add catastrophe. Someone may have behaved badly. Do not let their lack of self-command become the reason you surrender yours. That last point deserves attention. When another person provokes you into behaving beneath your own standards, who actually control the interaction, you may win the argument and lose command of yourself. This is especially visible in modern communication. Technology has dramatically shortened the distance between emotion and action. There was once friction between anger and expression. A letter had to be written, perhaps rewritten, placed in an envelope, sent. Time naturally entered the process. Now anger can become public in seconds. A notification appears. The heart rate changes. The thumbs begin moving. Send. And only afterward does reflection arrive. We have created technologies capable of transmitting thought faster than wisdom can evaluate it. That makes delay more valuable, not less. The ability to respond instantly is technological power. The decision not to respond instantly is psychological power. Consider criticism at work. Your manager challenges something you produced. Before the sentence is even finished, the mind may begin defending identity. They don't appreciate how much work went into this. They're always targeting me. Maybe they think I'm incompetent. Now the actual subject of the conversation is disappearing. The project is no longer being discussed. Your identity is on trial. Once identity feels threatened, listening becomes difficult. The nervous system prepares defense. You interrupt, explain, justify, perhaps attack. Later, when emotion settles, you discover that part of the criticism was useful, but by then the interaction has become more complicated than the original problem. The mentally stronger response is not passive agreement. It is postponing defense long enough to understand what is actually being said. That might sound like, "Let me make sure I understand your concern." 7 ordinary words. Yet psychologically, something important has happened. Reaction has been delayed. Information can enter before ego closes the door. Seneca examined anger extensively because he saw how quickly it could turn temporary provocation into lasting damage. Anger promises power, often produces servitude. Someone says a sentence and suddenly controls your voice, your breathing, your attention, your evening, perhaps your behavior. Hours later, the person who offended you may be peacefully asleep while you continue conducting the argument in your head. Who, then, remains imprisoned by the event? This does not mean anger is always irrational. Anger can signal violation, injustice, betrayal, a cross boundary. The question is not whether anger contains information. The question is whether anger should also receive executive authority. A fire alarm is useful because it alerts you. You would not appoint the fire alarm chief architect of the building. Emotion can alert. Judgment must still decide. Modern psychology approaches emotional regulation through different frameworks, but one useful distinction is between experiencing an emotion and acting impulsively because of it. Emotional regulation is not simply suppression. In fact, repeatedly suppressing emotion can create its own problems. Regulation involves recognizing the emotional state, understanding what may be contributing to it, and choosing how to respond. This overlaps interestingly with the ancient concern for examining impressions, though the traditions should not be confused. The language differs. The underlying practical question is familiar. Can awareness enter before behavior becomes automatic? That is the space we are trying to create. Rejection tests the space severely. A job application is rejected. A romantic interest says no. An investor declines. A publisher refuses the manuscript. The first pain may be unavoidable, but notice what often follows. The mind moves from event to identity. They rejected the proposal. Becomes, I'm not good enough. Then perhaps, nobody will ever take me seriously. One rejection has somehow become a prediction about the entire future. This is not emotional weakness. It is a common feature of cognition. The mind seeks patterns and explanations, but the explanation it produces under emotional pressure is not always reliable. Delay gives you time to separate. This hurts from, this defines me. Those are radically different statements. Relationships may be the hardest arena for this discipline because the people closest to us possess access to our most sensitive interpretations. A stranger's comment may irritate you. A loved one's comment can awaken 10 years of memory. Suddenly, you are not responding only to the sentence spoken tonight. You are responding to every similar sentence, every previous disappointment, every fear associated with it. The emotional intensity feels disproportionate because the present event has activated an entire history. This is why delaying reaction is not weakness. Sometimes silence for 30 seconds requires more strength than shouting for 30 minutes. The delay allows you to ask, what exactly am I reacting to? The words, the intention, my interpretation, or an old wound that these words happen to touch? That question can save relationships from arguments in which neither person is actually responding to present. Competition creates another version. Someone succeeds where you wanted to succeed. A colleague gets promoted. Another entrepreneur grows faster. Another creator attracts the audience you wanted. Envy arrives before philosophy. This is human. But then comes the second movement. Do you convert their achievement into evidence of your inadequacy? Do you begin diminishing them? Do you abandon your own path because someone appears further ahead? Or can you delay long enough to extract information? What do they do well? What can be learned? What does their success actually change about your responsibilities today? Often, very little. The scoreboard changed. Your work remains. This brings us to a difficult truth. Many people say they want peace, when what they actually want is a world that never provokes them. Those are not the same thing. A peaceful life cannot require universal cooperation. Someone will misunderstand you. Someone will be rude. Plans will change. Technology will fail at inconvenient moments. You will be criticized unfairly. You will occasionally be criticized fairly. Traffic will exist. People will arrive late. People will disappoint you. You will disappoint yourself. If tranquility requires eliminating these conditions, tranquility becomes impossible. The stronger project is building enough internal space that every disturbance does not automatically become command. So how is this practiced? Not through grand declarations, through seconds. For the next week, choose one rule. When emotionally activated, do not make the first impulse the final action. That is the practice. An irritating email arrives. Read it once. Do not answer immediately. Notice the body before composing the response. A relationship argument begins. Before producing the sentence designed to wound, pause. Not forever. Long enough for intention to return. Someone criticizes you. Before defending yourself, ask, what part of this, if any, is useful? You feel envy. Before condemning yourself for feeling it, Examine what the emotion reveals about your own desires. You become anxious about the future. Before trying to solve everything, write down the actual problem. Reduce interpretation to facts. Then ask what action is available now. The pause does not need to be dramatic. Sometimes 3 breaths are enough. Sometimes 10 minutes. Sometimes 1 night's sleep. The duration matters less than the principle. Do not let emotional speed decide irreversible actions. There's another practical technique worth adopting. When emotion is intense, change the language from identity to experience. Not, I am furious, but I'm experiencing anger. Not, I'm a failure, but I'm experiencing disappointment after failing at something. Not, I'm anxious, but anxiety is present right now. The difference may appear grammatical. Psychologically, it creates distance. The emotion becomes something occurring within experience, not the total definition of the person experiencing it. You're not denying the emotion. You are preventing it from occupying the entire identity. Then ask one final question. What response will I respect tomorrow? Not what response feels satisfying for 10 seconds. Not what proves that you won. Not what punishes the other person most effectively. What response will remain consistent with your values after the emotional temperature falls? This is where Stoicism leaves the page. It enters the meeting, the marriage, the comment section, the negotiation, the hospital waiting room, the traffic jam, the moment when your child tests your patience, the moment when someone humiliates you publicly. Philosophy becomes real when the body is activated and the old reaction is available, but you choose differently. Over time, repeated delay becomes habit. Habit changes identity. You begin becoming someone who does not need to answer everything immediately. Someone who can tolerate the discomfort of uncertainty. Someone who can hear criticism without instantly collapsing or attacking. Someone who recognizes anger without giving it unrestricted authority. This is not emotional numbness. It is emotional range with governance. And perhaps that is closer to genuine strength than being unaffected by anything. The strong mind is not empty of storms. It has simply stopped giving every storm command to ship. But another problem now appears. Creating space between event and reaction is easier when discomfort is mild. What happens when discomfort becomes intense? When hunger appears, fatigue, cold, boredom, loneliness, physical strain, delayed gratification. When the body itself begins demanding relief. Modern life increasingly allows us to escape discomfort almost immediately. Food arrives. Entertainment begins. Rooms become warmer. Notifications fill silence. Convenience removes friction. That sounds like progress, and much of it is. But what happens to a mind that gradually loses its ability to tolerate being uncomfortable? If every discomfort must be immediately removed, does comfort remain a luxury, or does it quietly become a dependency? That question leads us to the third Stoic habit. Practice discomfort before life chooses it for you. Chapter 3. Practice discomfort before life chooses it for you. Stoic habit 3. Voluntarily do difficult things. Comfort is one of civilization's greatest achievements. It is also something the human mind can become dangerously dependent upon. There is nothing inherently noble about being cold, hungry, exhausted, or deprived. Human progress has rightly removed enormous amounts of unnecessary suffering. Heating is better than freezing. Medicine is better than untreated pain. Reliable food is better than hunger. Technology has made communication, travel, work, and everyday living easier in ways ancient philosophers could barely have conceived. The problem begins somewhere else. It begins when comfort stops being something we appreciate and becomes something we require in order to function well. When boredom becomes intolerable, when waiting feels unbearable, when criticism feels like injury, when silence immediately produces the urge to reach for a screen, when hunger for an hour feels like an emergency, when difficult work is postponed because the mind is not in the mood, when every unpleasant emotion must be escaped as quickly as possible. At that point, comfort is no longer simply serving us. We may be serving it. And a person who must always be comfortable has given life an extraordinarily easy way to control them. The Stoic interest in voluntary discomfort is often misunderstood because modern culture tends to romanticize extremes. Cold plunges, punishing workouts, severe fasting, sleep deprivation, public displays of toughness. People can turn discomfort into another competition for status. But suffering for its own sake was never the deepest philosophical point. The more interesting question is this: how much of your behavior is being governed by your unwillingness to feel uncomfortable? That question reaches far beyond physical discomfort. Perhaps you remain silent in meetings because disagreement feels uncomfortable. Perhaps you stay in an unhealthy relationship because loneliness feels uncomfortable. Perhaps you avoid checking your finances because the numbers might make you uncomfortable. Perhaps you never publish your work because judgment feels uncomfortable. Perhaps you cannot spend 20 minutes alone without entertainment because the silence feels uncomfortable. Perhaps you procrastinate not because the task is difficult, but because beginning it produces a few minutes of psychological friction. Then discomfort is already directing your life. You are simply calling it preference. Seneca provides one of the clearest ancient examples of deliberate discomfort in his moral letters. He recommends periodically living with very simple food and rough clothing while asking whether this was a condition one had feared. The purpose was not poverty tourism, nor was it an argument that actual poverty is easy. Real deprivation carries dangers and burdens that voluntary simplicity does not reproduce. Seneca's exercise was psychological. He wanted to weaken fear's dependence on abstraction. A person surrounded by luxury can become terrified of losing luxury precisely because they have never tested what they can live without. The mind creates a frightening picture. What if I lose this? What if life becomes harder? What if I have less? Voluntary simplicity answers with experience. Perhaps less is unpleasant, but survivable. Perhaps inconvenience is uncomfortable, but not catastrophic. Perhaps the mind has been treating luxury as necessity. This creates an important distinction. The practice is not. Make yourself suffer because suffering is virtuous. It is occasionally remove something comfortable so you can discover whether you still govern yourself without it. This is one reason voluntary discomfort can be understood as a kind of audit. You are examining dependency. Take away convenience temporarily and observe what appears. Take away entertainment and notice restlessness. Take away praise and notice insecurity. Take away immediate gratification and notice craving. Take away certainty and notice the mind's demand for guarantees. Discomfort reveals attachments that comfort keeps hidden. As long as everything goes according to preference, you may never discover how dependent your peace has become upon those preferences. Difficulty exposes a contract. I can remain calm, provided nobody insults me. I can remain disciplined, provided I feel motivated. I can be generous, provided I have plenty. I can be patient, provided nobody inconveniences me. I can remain confident, provided people approve of me. Those conditions matter. They reveal that what appeared to be character may sometimes have been favorable circumstances. Marcus Aurelius repeatedly reminded himself that difficulty could become material for action rather than merely an interruption to it. This does not mean every hardship is secretly beneficial. Some experiences wound people deeply. Some losses are simply losses. Some adversity leaves consequences that cannot be converted into an inspirational lesson. Stoicism becomes shallow when it treats every tragedy as a motivational exercise. But ordinary discomfort is different. The inconvenience, the difficult task, the criticism, the delay, the failed attempt, the morning when motivation is absent. These moments offer repeated opportunities to practice not being ruled by preference. And this is where voluntary difficulty becomes useful. You train under manageable conditions so that the first encounter with discomfort does not occur when the stakes are high. Athletes understand this intuitively. Training deliberately introduces stress, not unlimited stress, not reckless damage, measured stress. A runner does not become more capable by avoiding every sensation of fatigue. A weightlifter does not develop strength by lifting only what already feels effortless. Adaptation requires an appropriate challenge. But physical training also teaches a psychological lesson. The first sensation, discomfort, does not always mean stop. Sometimes it means the work has begun. That distinction is crucial because modern convenience can teach the opposite lesson. If something feels unpleasant, remove it immediately. Hungry? Eat. Bored? Scroll. Lonely? Open an app. Uncertain? Search for reassurance. Tired of working? Switch tabs. Emotionally uncomfortable? Distract yourself. Again, none of these responses is automatically wrong. Rest matters. Food matters. Connection matters. Entertainment has value. The danger lies in automatic escape, when every uncomfortable state immediately triggers relief-seeking behavior. The mind never learns an important truth. An urge can exist without being obeyed. Modern psychology offers useful concepts here, particularly around delayed gratification, distress tolerance, habit formation, and emotional regulation. These fields are not scientific confirmations of Stoicism. They arise from different traditions and methods, but they help explain why repeatedly tolerating manageable discomfort can matter. Habits often develop around cues and responses. An unpleasant feeling becomes a cue. Boredom appears. The phone is opened. Stress appears. Food is sought. Anxiety appears. Reassurance is requested. A difficult assignment appears. Another easier task suddenly becomes urgent. Repeated enough, the sequence becomes increasingly automatic. The person may eventually believe, this is just who I am. But what looks like personality may partly be a practice response. And practice responses can sometimes be retrained. Consider procrastination. It is often described as laziness. That explanation is frequently inadequate. A person may work extremely hard on low-priority tasks while avoiding one important project. Why? Because the important project produces discomfort, uncertainty, fear of failure, fear of judgment, confusion, perfectionism. The mind discovers that postponing the task reduces discomfort immediately. That relief becomes rewarding, so avoidance is reinforced. Tomorrow, the same mechanism repeats. From this perspective, one way to weaken procrastination is not to wait until the task feels comfortable. It is to improve your capacity to begin while discomfort is still present. Sit with the blank page. Make the difficult call. Open the document. Work for 20 minutes before evaluating how you feel. You are not merely completing a task. You are training a relationship with friction. Entrepreneurship contains the same lesson on a larger scale. People are often attracted to the visible parts of entrepreneurship: independence, money, recognition, growth. But much of the actual work consists of uncertainty. A product may fail. A client may disappear. A strategy may stop working. Revenue fluctuates. Decisions must be made without complete information. Someone whose psychological stability requires certainty will find this environment particularly punishing. The entrepreneur cannot train for every possible crisis, but they can practice uncertainty, making decisions without endless reassurance, testing ideas before they feel perfect, hearing no without interpreting rejection as humiliation, allowing temporary failure to become information. The discomfort remains. Its authority decreases. Relationships require their own form of voluntary difficulty. People sometimes preserve temporary comfort at the expense of long-term intimacy. They avoid saying, "That hurt me. I was wrong. I need help. This isn't working. I don't agree. I'm sorry." Why? Because honesty creates immediate discomfort. Avoidance creates immediate relief. But the relief is expensive. Unspoken resentment accumulates. Boundaries disappear. Assumptions replace conversation. The relationship becomes superficially peaceful while becoming internally unstable. Here, voluntarily choosing discomfort may mean initiating the conversation you would rather postpone, not aggressively, not impulsively, with care. You accept 20 minutes of discomfort because avoiding it for 20 months would cost more. Mental strength is sometimes nothing more dramatic than choosing the difficult discomfort over the destructive one. Social media has created another laboratory for this practice. Try sitting somewhere for 10 minutes without touching your phone. No podcast, no music, no messages, No scrolling. Simply wait. For many people, something appears surprisingly quickly. Restlessness. The hand moves almost automatically. There's a desire to check something without even knowing what needs checking. This is valuable information. The discomfort reveals how strongly attention has been conditioned toward stimulation. Again, the solution is not to declare technology evil. The deeper practice is recovering choice. Can you experience boredom without immediately medicating it with stimulation? Can you stand in a queue without requiring entertainment? Can you eat without consuming content? Can you walk without filling every silence? A mind that cannot tolerate unstimulated moments becomes increasingly easy for external systems to capture. Attention becomes available to whoever designs the most compelling interruption. Ambition also requires discomfort. If you genuinely want to become exceptional at something, there will be long periods when your ability does not match your standards. The writer can see the difference between the sentence they wanted and the sentence they produced. The athlete knows the performance was not good enough. The researcher reaches another dead end. The musician hears every mistake. This gap is uncomfortable. Many people escape it by quitting. Others reduce their standards. Some avoid beginning entirely, so they never have to discover their current limitations. But skill requires remaining in the gap long enough to improve. Competence is built partly through the ability to tolerate being temporarily incompetent. That is an uncomfortable truth. There is also a danger here that must be addressed. Voluntary discomfort can become self-punishment. That is not the goal. You do not need to injure yourself. You do not need dangerous fasting. You do not need extreme cold exposure. You do not need to deny legitimate medical needs, sleep, nutrition, safety, or recovery. There is no wisdom in damaging the instrument you are trying to train. The purpose is not maximum suffering. The purpose is chosen friction. Small, safe experiences that challenge automatic preference. Take the stairs sometimes. Finish a reasonable workout when the mind begins bargaining. Wait before purchasing something impulsively. Choose a simple meal when you could choose excess. Begin difficult work before entertainment. Leave the phone in another room while reading. Spend part of the journey without stimulation. Have the conversation you have been avoiding. Allow someone else to have the final word in an argument that no longer matters. Do something useful when nobody will praise you for doing it. Each practice asks the same question. Can I choose according to principle when comfort recommends something else? For the next 7 days, choose one form of discomfort that is safe, modest, and repeatable. Do not choose something theatrical. Choose something revealing. If your weakness is distraction, practice silence. If your weakness is procrastination, begin the hardest meaningful task before seeking entertainment. If your weakness is impulsive spending, create a waiting period before unnecessary purchases. If your weakness is approval, allow a minor misunderstanding to exist without compulsively explaining yourself. If your weakness is avoidance, initiate one necessary conversation. Then observe what happens inside you. Do not merely endure the discomfort. Study it. What does the mind say? Just this once. You deserve a break. Do it tomorrow. Check your phone quickly. This is pointless. You shouldn't have to feel this way. Listen carefully. You are hearing the language through which habit protects itself. Do not fight the voice dramatically. Do not hate it. Simply recognize. An urge has appeared. Then decide whether the urge deserves obedience. That moment is the training. Eventually, something changes. Not because discomfort becomes pleasurable. It may remain uncomfortable. What changes is your interpretation of it. Discomfort stops automatically, meaning danger. Boredom stops automatically, meaning something must be consumed. Difficulty stops automatically, meaning something is wrong. Criticism stops automatically, meaning identity is threatened. Effort stops automatically, meaning you should quit. You begin discovering that many uncomfortable experiences rise, remain for a while, and pass. You are not required to obey them. This creates a particular kind of confidence. Not the confidence that life will be easy. The confidence that ease is not required. Return now to the deeper purpose. The Stoic who occasionally chose simplicity was not trying to become impressive. The practice was designed to weaken fortune's leverage. If I can live with less, losing something becomes less terrifying. If I can tolerate discomfort, comfort cannot bargain with my principles as easily. If I can endure disapproval, I become less tempted to betray myself for applause. If I can tolerate uncertainty, I do not need false certainty before acting. If I can experience desire without immediate gratification, desire stops behaving like a command. This is freedom in a less glamorous form. Not the freedom to have everything you want. The freedom not to need everything you want in order to remain yourself. And perhaps this is the real question beneath voluntary discomfort. What would remain if the comfort were taken away? Your status, your convenience, your familiar routine, your applause, your certainty, your possessions, your physical ease. What part of you remains when circumstances stop cooperating? You do not need to lose everything to begin answering that question. You can rehearse small forms of difficulty now, not because disaster is inevitable, but because change is. Everything external is unstable to some degree. Bodies change, markets change, relationships change, careers change, fortunes change. The future does not promise continuity, which leads us toward a darker Stoic practice. If voluntary discomfort prepares us to tolerate difficulty, what happens when we deliberately consider the difficulties we cannot choose? Loss, failure, rejection, separation, uncertainty, even death. Would thinking about these possibilities make us more anxious? Or could there be a disciplined way of looking toward adversity that makes us less afraid of its arrival? That question leads to the fourth Stoic habit. Rehearse adversity without living in fear. Chapter 4. Rehearse adversity without living in fear. Stoic habit 4. Remember that things can go wrong. There is a difference between expecting disaster and refusing to be surprised by the possibility of difficulty. The distinction is subtle, but psychologically enormous. One produces fear. The other can produce preparedness. Human beings spend much of their lives trying to secure the future. We save money, purchase insurance, create contracts, build emergency systems, make backup plans, schedule medical examinations, and lock our doors at night. We understand practical preparation. Yet, when preparation enters the mind, something strange happens. We are often told not to think about what could go wrong. Don't think about failure. Don't think about losing the opportunity. Don't think about rejection. Don't think about death. Stay positive. Expect the best. And there is wisdom in refusing to spend life catastrophizing about possibilities that may never occur. But refusing to acknowledge adversity creates a different vulnerability. If your peace depends upon believing that nothing will go wrong, then the possibility of something going wrong will always terrify you. Stoicism proposes a more difficult relationship with uncertainty, not pessimism, not paranoia, not expecting tragedy around every corner. Something quieter. Look at what you fear before it arrives, and ask whether you could meet it with character if it did. The practice later came to be described as premeditatio malorum, the premeditation or contemplation of possible difficulties. Its purpose is frequently misunderstood. Someone hearing the idea for the first time may reasonably ask, why deliberately think about unpleasant possibilities? Isn't that anxiety? Doesn't worrying about failure make failure more frightening? The answer depends entirely upon what the mind is doing with the possibility. Anxiety often asks, what if something terrible happens? And then continues, I couldn't handle it. Everything would be ruined. My life would be over. I need certainty that this won't happen. Stoic preparation asks a different question. Something difficult could happen. If it did, how would I meet it well? One rehearses helplessness. The other rehearses response. One demands certainty. The other develops readiness. That distinction changes the entire exercise. Seneca wrote repeatedly about our tendency to suffer through anticipation. He observed that people can become tormented not only by present difficulty, but by events that have not happened and may never happen. This remains painfully familiar. A person receives an email late in the afternoon and spends the entire evening predicting tomorrow's bad news. Someone notices an unfamiliar physical sensation and mentally travels immediately toward the worst diagnosis. An employee hears rumors of restructuring and has already lost a job, the house, and the future before any decision has been announced. The mind is extraordinarily capable of turning possibility into psychological reality. But Seneca's answer was not simply, never think about bad things. That would leave fear untouched. Instead, part of his philosophical strategy was to examine feared possibilities more directly, because fear often becomes enormous when its object remains vague. The undefined catastrophe can become infinitely terrible. Examine it closely, and boundaries begin to appear. Suppose you fear losing your job. The anxious mind says, I cannot lose this job. Notice the absolute language. Cannot. That word transforms an unwanted possibility into an intolerable one. Stoic examination becomes more precise. If the position disappeared, what would actually happen? There might be financial pressure, embarrassment, disappointment, a disruption to plans, perhaps a difficult job search, perhaps major sacrifices. None of those should be trivialized. Unemployment can create serious hardship, but now continue. What resources exist? What expenses could be reduced? What skills remain? Who could be contacted? What alternative work could be considered? What would the first 72 hours require? Suddenly, the mind has moved from catastrophe to response. You still do not want the event, but you are no longer required to believe that you would become psychologically useless if it occurred. That is the point. Preparedness does not make the undesirable desirable. It makes it less undefined. Financial fear operates similarly. People often avoid looking directly at money problems because numbers remove ambiguity. An unopened bill remains frightening in an abstract way. A bank balance not examined can become whatever fear wants it to become. Avoidance provides temporary relief at the cost of long-term vulnerability. A Stoic orientation would not tell someone that money does not matter. That would be detached from reality. It would ask a different question. What could be faced now? What would happen if income fell? What expenses are genuinely necessary? What debts require attention? Where is lifestyle being mistaken for necessity? What skills could become economically useful? What part of financial security depends upon conditions outside you, and what part can still be strengthened? Preparation replaces vague dread with defined action. Rejection reveals another layer of the practice. What exactly are you afraid will happen if someone says no? Not getting the job? Not receiving the investment? Not being chosen romantically? Not being accepted by the group? Those things hurt. But often the deepest fear lies underneath the event. What will the rejection mean about me? That is where self-concept enters. A rejection becomes dangerous when an external decision is allowed to define internal worth. One employer says no, and the mind hears, you are not talented. One relationship ends, and the mind hears, you are unlovable. One proposal fails, and the mind hears, you are foolish to try. Premeditation can expose this confusion before the event. Ask, if they say no, what actually remains? Your skills remain. Your ability to learn remains. Your character remains. Your next decision remains. Your dignity can remain. The rejection removes an outcome. It does not automatically remove the person. This is why the question from our earlier discussion deserves to return. What would remain if the outcome were taken away from you? It is an uncomfortable question. That is precisely why it matters. If your identity disappears when the achievement disappears, then perhaps achievement has been carrying more psychological weight than it should. The entrepreneur is not merely the company valuation. The athlete is not merely the medal. The academic is not merely the publication. The creator is not merely the view count. The employee is not merely the job title. Outcomes matter. But when outcomes become identity, uncertainty becomes existential. You are no longer afraid merely of losing something. You are afraid of losing yourself. Relationships expose this most painfully. To love someone is to accept vulnerability. There is no meaningful intimacy without it. You cannot simultaneously love deeply and possess a guarantee that nothing will ever change. People change. Circumstances change. Relationships sometimes end. And ultimately, every relationship is temporary because human life itself is temporary. This can sound severe, Yet the Stoic purpose is not to make love colder. It is almost the opposite. Marcus Aurelius repeatedly reminded himself of mortality and change. Epictetus encouraged awareness that the people we love are mortal. Taken superficially, this can sound emotionally detached. Taken seriously, it becomes an argument for presence. If someone is not guaranteed to be here forever, then perhaps their presence deserves more attention now. Perhaps familiarity should not become neglect. Perhaps the ordinary breakfast matters. The phone call matters. The walk matters. The conversation you assume you can have next year matters now. Mortality does not have to diminish love. It can remove our illusion that love has unlimited time. This reveals the strange second function of contemplating adversity. It prepares us for loss. But it can also restore gratitude for what has not yet been lost. Most gratitude practices ask you to notice what you have. Stoic contemplation adds another dimension. Recognize that what you have is not guaranteed. The home you complain about would be precious after losing it. The body you criticize is performing thousands of functions without asking for applause. The ordinary person sitting across from you may one day become someone you would give almost anything to speak with again. The routine you call boring may later appear as one of the most peaceful periods of your life. Human beings adapt quickly to blessings. Psychologists sometimes describe this more broadly through hedonic adaptation. Experiences that initially produce strong emotion can become familiar over time. What was once extraordinary becomes normal, and what becomes normal often becomes invisible. Contemplating impermanence can interrupt that invisibility, not through panic, through attention. Failure deserves a similar examination. Many people are not afraid of failing because failure is physically dangerous. They fear humiliation, the meeting where the idea is rejected, the business that closes publicly, the presentation where the words disappear, the examination that goes badly, the social media post that attracts ridicule. Public embarrassment feels threatening because human beings are social creatures. Reputation matters to us. But how much authority should embarrassment possess? Premeditation asks you to mentally approach the possibility. Suppose the presentation goes badly. Then what? Perhaps people notice. Perhaps someone judges you. Perhaps you feel embarrassed. Then morning arrives. People return to their own problems. You review what happened. You practice. You present again. Often the event we fear has been given a permanence it does not possess. The embarrassment may last minutes. Our avoidance of embarrassment can last years. There's a profound cost to refusing the possibility of failure. You begin designing life around protection. Don't apply, then you cannot be rejected. Don't publish, then you cannot be criticized. Don't speak, then you cannot sound foolish. Don't love deeply, then perhaps loss will hurt less. Don't attempt anything ambitious, then failure cannot expose you. Eventually safety succeeds. Nothing happens, and that becomes a failure. Plans changing provide a smaller but frequent training ground. A flight is canceled. A meeting moves. Someone arrives late. Weather ruins the event. A project takes twice as long as expected. The mind often reacts not merely to inconvenience, but to violated expectation. Reality was supposed to follow the script. It didn't. Here, Stoic preparation can become extremely practical. Before an important day, acknowledge something may not go according to plan, not because you are pessimistic, because you live in a world containing other people, technology, traffic, weather, error, and chance. The expectation changes from everything must go correctly to I will prepare carefully, and if something changes, I will adapt. That is a far more durable form of confidence. And then there is mortality. The subject modern life works remarkably hard to hide. We speak endlessly about optimization, longevity, achievement, productivity, future plans. But beneath every ambition lies a fact that Marcus Aurelius returned to repeatedly. Time is limited. Stoic reflection on mortality was not designed to create obsession with death. It was designed to create seriousness about life. If time were unlimited, almost nothing would be urgent. You could apologize in 50 years. Begin the work next century. Call your parents eventually. Travel someday. Say what matters later. But time is not unlimited. Mortality gives weight to choice. A finite life means attention has a cost. Every hour spent on one thing is an hour unavailable for another. This makes the question, what deserves my life, far more important than what can fill my time. So, how do we practice premeditatio malorum without turning it into chronic worry? The answer is structure. Do not catastrophize throughout the day. Set aside a brief period for deliberate preparation. Choose one meaningful concern. Then write 3 sentences. What could reasonably go wrong? Not every imaginable disaster. A realistic difficulty. If it happened, what would still be within my control? Your response, your communication, your preparation, your next decision, your willingness to seek help, your principles. Then, what can I do now that would make me more prepared without becoming obsessed? Save some money. Back up the file. Prepare more carefully. Have the conversation. Develop another skill. Apologize while there is still time. Purchase appropriate insurance. Clarify the plan. Tell someone you love them. Then stop. Return to the present. This final step matters. Stoic preparation should return you to life, not remove you from it. You can also practice with smaller uncertainty. Before a presentation, I may forget something. If I do, I will pause, look at my notes, and continue. Before a difficult conversation, they may respond badly. I will remain clear and respectful. Before publishing creative work, some people may dislike it. Their response may contain useful information, or it may simply reflect taste. Before a competition, I may lose. My responsibility is to perform with discipline. Before an important plan, something may change. I will adapt rather than treating inconvenience as catastrophe. Notice what this practice does. The mind is no longer rehearsing helplessness. It is rehearsing agency. Over time, uncertainty begins to change character. You stop asking life for guarantees it cannot provide. You still prepare. You still care. You still prefer good outcomes. But your peace becomes less dependent upon pretending that unfavorable outcomes are impossible. And something else happens. Ordinary life becomes more visible. You begin appreciating what has not disappeared. The person who is still here. The body that still carries you. The work still available. The quiet morning. The ordinary meal. The chance to begin again. You do not need to become afraid of losing these things. You simply stop behaving as though they were promised forever. Perhaps that is the paradox of contemplating adversity. Done poorly, it steals the present by filling it with fear. Done wisely, it returns you to the present with greater clarity. Anxiety says, something terrible could happen, and I won't survive it. Preparation says, something difficult could happen, so let me strengthen what would remain. And gratitude adds, since it has not happened today, let me notice what is still here. This is not pessimism. It is a refusal to make fragility invisible, because life is fragile. Plans are fragile. Fortune is fragile. Bodies are fragile. Relationships are fragile. The Stoic response is not despair. It is to build character precisely because circumstances cannot be permanently secured. But this brings us to the final, and perhaps hardest problem. Suppose you know what is under your control. Suppose you can pause before reacting. Suppose you have trained yourself to tolerate discomfort. Suppose you have considered adversity and prepared yourself to meet it. A question still remains. When the difficult moment actually arrives, what determines what you do? If fear tells you one thing, ambition another, anger another, comfort another, and your principles something else entirely, which voice receives authority? Because eventually, mental strength requires more than managing circumstances. It requires deciding what kind of person you will be when circumstances make that decision expensive. And that leads us to the 5th Stoic habit. Lie by principles, not by mood. Chapter 5. Lie by principles, not by mood. Stoic habit 5. Decide who you are before the moment arrives. Character is easy when it costs nothing. Patience is easy when nobody is testing it. Honesty is easy when the truth carries no consequence. Discipline is easy when motivation is high. Courage is easy when nothing valuable is at risk. Generosity is easy when you have more than enough. and principles are easy to defend when following them happens to be convenient. The real examination begins when virtue becomes expensive, when telling the truth may cost you an opportunity, when remaining calm feels less satisfying than retaliation, when nobody would discover the shortcut, when keeping your promise requires effort you no longer feel like giving, when someone treats you unfairly and cruelty suddenly feels justified, when quitting would bring immediate relief. These are the moments in which philosophy stops being something you understand and becomes something you are. This is why the deepest concern of Stoicism was never emotional numbness. It was character, not whether life could be made comfortable, not whether circumstances could be controlled, not whether every unpleasant feeling could be eliminated, but whether a human being could develop enough inner order to act well even when circumstances made acting well difficult. That is a much more demanding ambition. The previous habits have gradually brought us here. First, we separated what belongs to us from what does not. Then we created space between events and reactions. We practiced tolerating discomfort rather than immediately escaping it. We considered adversity before it arrived, so uncertainty would lose some of its power to surprise us. But all of these practices eventually confront the same question. What is all this self-control for? Control for its own sake is not virtue. A cruel person can be disciplined. A dishonest person can be patient. A manipulator can regulate emotion. A tyrant can tolerate discomfort. Mental strength without moral direction can simply make someone more effective at doing harm. Stoicism therefore asks something beyond resilience. What kind of person is your strength serving? For the ancient Stoics, virtue stood at the center of the philosophical life. Wisdom, justice, courage, temperance. These were not decorative ideals to admire from a distance. They were standards for conduct. Marcus Aurelius repeatedly examined whether his behavior was consistent with his responsibilities as a human being and as someone entrusted with power. Epictetus focused relentlessly on the proper use of choice and judgment. Seneca explored the relationship between philosophy and conduct, repeatedly challenging the gap between knowing what is right and actually living it. Different personalities, different circumstances, the same uncomfortable problem. A person can know a great deal about goodness without becoming good. Knowledge does not automatically become character. You can understand patience and remain impatient. You can study courage and continue avoiding every frightening conversation. You can read about discipline while procrastinating. You can explain emotional regulation perfectly and still send the message you regret 5 minutes later. You can quote Marcus Aurelius and behave terribly toward the waiter. There is no contradiction in human beings more common than knowing better and doing worse. That is because philosophy competes with something powerful: mood, impulse, convenience, social pressure, fear, desire, habit. When these forces agree with your principles, character feels effortless. The test comes when they separate. Consider motivation. Modern self-improvement culture gives motivation enormous importance. People search for ways to feel inspired. Videos, music, quotes, morning routines, vision boards, motivational speeches. There is nothing wrong with inspiration. It can initiate action. But motivation is unstable. Some mornings you wake with energy. Others you do not. Sometimes the project feels meaningful. Sometimes it feels tedious. Sometimes exercise feels satisfying. Sometimes the gym feels like the last place you want to be. Sometimes writing flows. Sometimes every sentence resists you. If action depends entirely upon feeling motivated, then mood becomes management. You work when mood permits. You train when mood approves. You keep promises when mood cooperates. And because mood changes constantly, behavior becomes inconsistent. The Stoic alternative is not to ignore feelings. It is to refuse to make them the highest authority. This leads to a more useful question then. What do I feel like doing? Ask, what would the person I respect do next? Not someday. Not under perfect conditions. Next, that word matters. Because character is rarely built through grand declarations. It is revealed through the next available action. You promised yourself you would finish the work. You are tired. What happens next? You discover a mistake that nobody else has noticed. Correcting it may embarrass you. What happens next? Someone insults you publicly. Anger presents several satisfying responses. What happens next? You could take credit for work you did not entirely do. Nobody would know. What happens next? The person you are trying to become is not built primarily through what you say you value. That person is built through these moments. Modern psychology offers an interesting parallel through research and theories concerning identity and behavior. People often organize behavior partly around their sense of who they are. Someone who thinks, "I'm trying to exercise," may experience each workout as a task requiring negotiation. Someone who increasingly sees physical activity as part of their identity may approach the same behavior differently. The action begins to answer a question about the self. This does not mean identity magically produces behavior. Behavior also helps construct identity. The relationship can move in both directions. You act, then interpret the action as evidence about who you are. You act again. The evidence accumulates. Eventually, the behavior feels less like something you occasionally force yourself to do and more like something consistent with the person you understand yourself to be. This is where Stoic practice and modern identity-based approaches can enter an interesting conversation. Character is not merely declared. It is rehearsed. Every action becomes a small piece of evidence. You tell the truth when lying would be easier. Evidence. You keep the promise when nobody would know if you broke it. Evidence. You apologize without defending yourself. Evidence. You resist a purchase you cannot afford. Evidence. You finish the difficult task without waiting for enthusiasm. Evidence. You refuse to join gossip about someone who is absent. Evidence. You lose without becoming bitter. Evidence. None of these actions proves that you have permanently become virtuous. Human beings are inconsistent, but repetition gradually creates a pattern, and patterns eventually become character. This is why what you do when nobody is watching matters so much. Public behavior has incentives: praise, status, reputation, approval. Private behavior removes many of them. When nobody can applaud you, what remains? When dishonesty would benefit you and discovery is unlikely, what remains? When kindness brings no social reward, what remains? When the work will never be posted online, what remains? Private action reveals something public performance can hide, whether the value belongs to you or merely to your reputation. A person can perform generosity because generosity looks admirable. A person can perform discipline because discipline attracts respect. A person can perform wisdom because wisdom creates status. But virtue performed primarily for applause remains dependent upon applause. Remove the audience, and the structure collapses. The Stoic project demands something stronger: character that survives privacy. Money provides an especially revealing test. Suppose dishonesty would increase your income, and the probability of being caught is extremely low. What prevents you? Fear of punishment, reputation, or principle? This distinction matters. If honesty exists only because consequences exist, then external circumstances are still governing behavior. Remove the consequence, and honesty disappears. Virtue asks whether some actions remain unacceptable even when they're profitable. That is difficult in cultures that measure success largely through outcomes: revenue, titles, followers, property, status, achievement. But Stoicism forces a different accounting. What did obtaining the outcome require you to become? A promotion obtained through betrayal may still be a promotion. A profitable deception may still be profitable. A victory achieved dishonorably may still appear on the scoreboard. External metrics cannot always distinguish success from corruption. Character can. Ambition, therefore, requires boundaries. Stoicism is sometimes misrepresented as anti-ambition, as though wanting to accomplish something is itself a philosophical failure. That is too simple. Marcus Aurelius governed an empire rather than retreating from responsibility. Seneca participated deeply in political and public life. The deeper concern is what ambition is allowed to purchase. Will you sacrifice sleep indefinitely, health, integrity, friendships, family, fairness, peace, your own principles? There is a point at which ambition stops serving life and begins consuming it. The question is not merely, how badly do I want this? It is, who am I willing to become in order to get it? Some prices are too high even when you can afford them. Anger presents an even more difficult examination because anger can make bad behavior feel morally righteous. When we are angry, we rarely experience ourselves as irrational villains. We experience ourselves as justified. They started it. They deserved it. Someone needed to tell them. I was only defending myself. This is why justified anger requires perhaps more discipline than unjustified anger. When you know you are obviously wrong, restraint is easier to recognize as necessary. When you believe you are right, almost anything can begin to feel permissible. Marcus Aurelius repeatedly reminded himself not to become like the people whose behavior disturbed him. That principle remains powerful. Another person's failure of character does not create an exemption from yours. If someone lies to you, you are still responsible for whether you become dishonest. If someone insults you, you remain responsible for whether you become cruel. If someone behaves unfairly, their injustice does not transform your injustice into virtue. You may need boundaries. You may need confrontation. You may need to leave. You may need to defend yourself. Stoicism does not require submission, but there is a difference between strong action and uncontrolled retaliation. The first is governed by purpose. The second is governed by injury. Relationships reveal this distinction every day. You can win an argument and damage the relationship. You can say something technically true in the most destructive possible way. You can punish someone with silence while calling it peace. You can keep a record of every mistake so that no disagreement ever begins on equal ground. The question of character changes the objective. Not, how do I win this? But, what does honesty, dignity, fairness, and self-respect require here? Sometimes the answer is reconciliation. Sometimes it is a boundary. Sometimes forgiveness. Sometimes departure. Principle does not guarantee softness. It guarantees direction. Then comes quitting. There are times when quitting is wise. Stoicism does not demand blind persistence. Some goals become irrational. Some projects fail. Some relationships become destructive. Some strategies need abandoning. Wisdom includes knowing when continuation is no longer justified. But quitting because something should end is different from quitting because discomfort has arrived. The challenge is distinguishing the two. Ask yourself, if this were easy, would I still believe it should end? If the answer is no, perhaps the problem is not the goal. Perhaps the problem is your current relationship with difficulty. This is where the previous chapter matters. A person who has never practiced discomfort will often interpret discomfort as evidence that the path is wrong. Sometimes discomfort simply means the path is demanding. So how do you turn principles into something stronger than mood? Begin by deciding them before the difficult moment. Do not wait until temptation arrives to decide whether honesty matters. Do not wait until rage arrives to decide what kind of person you want to be in conflict. Do not wait until exhaustion arrives to decide whether commitments matter. Decisions made under emotional pressure are easily negotiated. Decisions made beforehand can become standards. Take 5 minutes and complete one sentence. When I am under pressure, I want to be someone who, perhaps, does not lie to escape consequences, does not make important decisions while angry, does not humiliate people during disagreement, keeps reasonable promises, does not spend money impulsively to change an emotion, admits mistakes quickly, finishes important work before seeking distraction, does not abandon principles for applause. Choose what actually matters to you, not what sounds impressive. Then identify the situation most likely to make you violate that standard. This is crucial. A principle without an anticipated test remains abstract. If you want patience, identify who tests it. If you want discipline, identify when you usually negotiate. If you want honesty, identify where dishonesty becomes tempting. If you want courage, identify what conversation you keep postponing. If you want temperance, identify what desire most easily becomes command. Then prepare one response beforehand, not 20. 1. When I become angry, I will wait before sending anything. When I want to avoid the work, I will do 10 minutes before deciding. When I make a mistake, I will acknowledge it before explaining it. When someone criticizes me, I will understand the criticism before defending myself. This turns philosophy into behavior. At the end of each day, conduct a brief review. Seneca described examining his own conduct at day's end, considering his actions and failures. You can adopt the principle without copying the ancient practice mechanically. Ask, where did I behave according to my standards today? Where did mood govern me? What triggered the difference? What will I do differently when the same situation returns? Do not turn this into self-punishment. The purpose is observation. A person who cannot look honestly at their failures cannot learn from them. But a person who turns every failure into self-hatred also learns very little. Character develops through correction, not condemnation. Eventually, something subtle begins to happen. You require less negotiation. The standard becomes familiar. You do not need to decide from the beginning every time. This is the power of habit. The first disciplined action may feel unnatural. The 50th feels less foreign. Eventually, the question shifts from, can I force myself to do this? Toward, why would I behave otherwise? Identity has begun absorbing the practice. This is why mental strength is not a mood. It is a standard you repeatedly return to. You will violate it sometimes. Return. You will react badly. Return. You will procrastinate. Return. You will discover hypocrisy in yourself. Return. You will know the right action and still choose the easier one. Examine it and return. Perfection is not required for direction. And perhaps this is the deepest meaning of all 5 habits. You cannot control everything that happens, but you can practice where attention returns. You cannot prevent the first emotion, but you can create space before action. You cannot remove discomfort from life, but you can stop treating discomfort as an emergency. You cannot guarantee that adversity will never arrive, but you can prepare to meet it without surrendering beforehand. And you cannot guarantee that you will always act according to principle, but you can decide which principles deserve your repeated loyalty. That is self-government, not absolute control over the mind, not emotional perfection, not invulnerability. Governance, the continuous work of bringing action back into alignment with what you have decided matters. So tomorrow morning, motivation may not arrive. Act with principle anyway. Someone may misunderstand you. Respond with principle anyway. An opportunity may tempt you to become dishonest. Choose principle anyway. You may lose. Remain principled in defeat. You may win. Remain principled in victory. Because circumstances constantly change. Mood constantly changes. Applause changes. Fortune changes. The person who depends upon all of them must change direction every time they do. But principles offer something different. A center, a place to return when emotion becomes loud. A standard against which choices can be measured when circumstances become confusing. And perhaps that is what an unshakable mind really means. Not a mind that never trembles, but a mind that remembers where to return when it does. Yet one final question remains. If mental strength is not control over the world, not the absence of emotion, not immunity to pain, and not permanent confidence, then what ultimately have these 5 habits been training us to become? What remains when control, restraint, discomfort, adversity, and character are understood as parts of the same discipline? That question takes us beyond individual habits, because the deepest lesson of Stoicism was never merely how to endure a difficult life. It was how to live a good life, even when life refuses to become easy. Conclusion, the territory that remains yours. There comes a point in every serious philosophy where the question changes. At first, we ask, how can I make my life better? Then, if we continue far enough, the question becomes more demanding. How should I live when life does not become better on command? That is where Stoicism becomes more than a philosophy of resilience, because life will not always cooperate with your plans. Some people will misunderstand you despite your best explanations. Some people will dislike you despite your good intentions. You may work intelligently and still lose. You may love deeply and still experience separation. You may prepare carefully and still be surprised. Money can disappear. Health can change. Careers can collapse. Relationships can end. Bodies age. Reputations shift. The future refuses to provide guarantees. And eventually, every human life reaches the one boundary no philosophy can negotiate away: mortality. Stoicism begins by refusing to lie about any of this, but it does not end in despair. It asks a different question. When so much of life cannot be commanded, what remains yours? There is a territory between what happens to you and what you become because of it. That territory is not unlimited. Sometimes circumstances overwhelm us. Sometimes emotion arrives with extraordinary force. Sometimes grief leaves little room for philosophy. Sometimes fear appears before reason has even entered the room. To be human is to be affected. The goal was never to escape that condition. The deeper task is to protect a small but enormously important territory within it, the territory of response, of judgment, of intention, of character, of the next action. This is the territory of self-government. Self-government does not mean perfect control over yourself. You will still become angry. You will still worry. You will still feel envy. You will still become discouraged. There will be mornings when discipline feels distant and evenings when your better judgment arrives 5 minutes too late. You will occasionally surrender to impulses you thought you had mastered. You will contradict your own principles. That does not make the practice meaningless. It makes the practice necessary. A government is not defined by the absence of disorder. It is defined by a capacity to restore order. Perhaps the same is true of the mind. Mental strength is not never losing your center. It is becoming better at returning to it. This is why Stoicism should never be confused with emotional coldness. A stone cannot be offended, but a stone cannot love. A machine does not grieve, but it cannot cherish anyone either. The inability to feel is not strength. The person who loves deeply will always be vulnerable to loss. The person who attempts meaningful work will always be vulnerable to failure. The person who cares about justice will sometimes become angry at injustice. The person who forms relationships will sometimes be disappointed. To remove vulnerability completely, you would have to remove much of what makes life worth experiencing. Stoicism asks for something more difficult than detachment. Remain open to life without becoming obedient to everything life makes you feel. Love, but do not possess. Care, but do not demand guarantees. Feel anger, but decide what anger is allowed to do. Experience fear, but do not automatically hand fear the steering wheel. Grieve when something valuable is lost, without concluding that because something ended, it was never worth having. That is not being unaffected by life. It is being fully affected while remaining responsible for what you do next. There's enormous dignity in that distinction, because the world constantly invites you to surrender authorship. Someone insults you and anger says, now you have permission to become cruel. Someone betrays you and resentment says, now you have permission to become bitter. Someone succeeds before you and envy says, now you have permission to despise their success. Something frightening happens and fear says, now you have permission to abandon your principles. You fail and shame says, now you have permission to stop trying. Every emotion presents an argument. Some arguments contain wisdom. Others contain distortion. Mental strength does not silence the courtroom. It refuses to let the loudest voice automatically become the judge. This is why control mattered. Not because you could control everything, but because discovering what you cannot control allows you to concentrate your life upon what you can influence. This is why delaying reaction mattered. Not because emotions are dangerous, but because temporary emotions should not always make permanent decisions. This is why discomfort mattered. Not because suffering is noble, but because a person who requires constant comfort becomes increasingly easy to command. This is why contemplating adversity mattered. Not because you should expect disaster, but because refusing to acknowledge uncertainty gives uncertainty more power. And this is why character mattered. Because eventually every technique must answer to a deeper purpose. What kind of human being are you trying to become? Without that question, discipline becomes empty. You can become highly disciplined in pursuit of something worthless. You can become emotionally controlled while treating people terribly. You can tolerate extraordinary discomfort for the sake of ego. You can become strategically calm while being profoundly dishonest. Self-mastery alone does not tell you what deserves mastery. That is why Stoicism placed virtue at the center, wisdom to see clearly, courage to act despite fear, justice to recognize that your life exists among other lives, temperance to prevent appetite from becoming master. Mental strength was never simply about becoming harder. It was about becoming harder to separate from your principles. And this brings entire philosophy into ordinary life, not the battlefield, not the emperor's palace, not ancient Rome. Tomorrow morning, the alarm rings. You do not feel like getting up. A small decision appears. Someone speaks impatiently to you. Another decision. You receive an email you dislike. Another. Someone receives recognition you wanted. Another. A purchase tempts you. Another. You make a mistake nobody has noticed. Another. You become tired, afraid, flattered, provoked, bored, disappointed. None of these moments looks historically significant. But character rarely announces the moment it is being built. It accumulates quietly. One response, then another, until what once required deliberate effort becomes familiar. That is how philosophy enters a life. Perhaps this is why Marcus Aurelius wrote reminders to himself, not commandments for humanity. Reminders, because even an emperor who had spent years thinking about philosophy still needed to remember. Epictetus taught practice because understanding alone was insufficient. Seneca examined his own conduct because knowledge did not exempt him from inconsistency. The ancient texts survive, but their survival is not the important part. The important part is whether the question they contain survives in you. When circumstances become difficult, who governs your conduct? For the next 7 days, do not try to practice everything in this audiobook. Choose one habit. Only one. Perhaps you will begin separating control from concern. Whenever anxiety appears, ask, what part of this is actually mine? Perhaps you will practice delaying reaction. When emotionally activated, refuse to let the first impulse become the final action. Perhaps you will choose one safe discomfort each day and discover whether an urge can exist without being obeyed. Perhaps you will spend a few minutes considering one realistic difficulty and preparing your response without catastrophizing. Or perhaps you will choose one principle and practice returning to it regardless of mood. 7 days. Not to become a Stoic, not to prove anything, simply to observe yourself more carefully. Notice where your peace is easily captured. Notice which emotions most easily become commands. Notice what discomfort you habitually escape. Notice which uncertainties frighten you because you demand guarantees from them. Notice the distance between the principles you admire and the actions you repeat. That distance is where the work is. And when you fail during those 7 days, because at some point you probably will, pay attention to what happens next. That moment may be more important than the failure. Will you condemn yourself? Abandon the practice? Declare that you lack discipline? Or will you do something much quieter? Return. There may be no more important word in self-government. Return. Return to what is yours. Return to the pause. Return to discipline. Return to preparation. Return to character. Again and again and again. Because eventually, the question is not whether life will disturb you. It will. The question is not whether circumstances will occasionally defeat your plans. They will. The question is not whether you will experience fear, anger, disappointment, grief, desire, or uncertainty. You will. The question is what authority those experiences will possess. Tomorrow will bring something you did not completely choose. Perhaps something trivial. Perhaps something difficult. Perhaps something wonderful. You cannot know. But tonight, you can decide what kind of relationship you want to have with the unknown. And perhaps that leaves us with the most important Stoic question of all. When something outside your control happens tomorrow, who will decide what happens inside you? If these ideas gave you something worth carrying beyond this audiobook, then you are warmly invited to continue the journey with Mindflow Studio. Here, we explore philosophy, psychology, self-mastery, and timeless ideas not simply as concepts to admire, but as questions to live. Subscribe if that is the kind of conversation you want more of. And until we meet again, remember, you do not become mentally stronger when life finally obeys you. You become stronger each time you become a little more difficult for circumstances to command.